This is the FM Gold channel of All India Radio. In the program News Analysis, now we bring you a discussion on India-US trade relations. The participants are Amity Sen, economic analyst, and Simran Sodhi, journalist.
Today we are discussing an aspect of the India-US relationship, and that is the trade issues between the two countries. India and the United States just completed a 2+2 dialogue, and the strategic partnership between the two countries has recently received a fresh boost. Amity, when you look at the India-US deadlock over the trade issues, generally how does this affect the overall relationship? Because bilaterally India and US have progressed on quite a few issues, whether it is defense, it is strategic. Why is trade becoming a stumbling block in this bilateral relationship?
Actually, if we look at the trade issues, I wouldn't exactly describe it as a deadlock. See, there are a couple of issues where you're right, there has been no movement and they really seem stuck. But, Indo-US bilateral trade, it is vast. US is our largest trading partner and our exports are increasing every year. But yes, it is worrying because India has been singled out by the US as one of the countries with which it runs a huge deficit, and President Donald Trump last year, it specifically asked the Commerce Department to find out the reason behind the trade deficit and whether, some irregular things were happening which was leading to the, growing trade deficit. So yes, you're correct, it is worrying, but then India and US, they have continuously talked. It's not that talks are not happening. Commerce Department, the US Trade Representative's Office and the Commerce Ministry in India, they have been in touch and they are actually discussing the contentious issues continuously.
Amity, when you see the fact that the US has also said that there's a surplus of $23 billion in India's trade with America, and that's something which worries the US. We've also seen that India is not the only country. The US under President Donald Trump, we see a change in direction as far as trade issues are concerned. It's an American view which is more America first. So how does this pan out with the fact that India has this surplus in trade?
Well, it is not that the trade surplus which India has, it has happened just after Donald Trump became the US president. Traditionally, we have had a surplus because of historical issues. If we analyze the details of, what we export to the US and what we import, so India has been traditionally exporting a lot of raw materials which, the US industry needs for making their goods. And also, India has been sending a lot of students to the US who have contributed to the economy. India has been sending a lot of IT professionals to their country who have actually generated employment and also added to their GDP. So when the Trump administration is looking at the trade deficit, it is actually seeing things in a very narrow way. So this is what the Indian Commerce Ministry, it is trying to bring to the notice of the Trump administration. So over the last few months, we have had several rounds of dialogues with them, and these are the points which have been specifically mentioned. Why there is a deficit and what has been happening. And actually India has taken quite a few steps since last year to increase its imports from the US. So that has also been highlighted to the US. So if we look at our trade figures from April to July this year, the trade deficit has actually gone down by $1.5 billion, which is substantial. And we are, proactively looking at areas where we can import more from the US. For instance, oil. Historically, we have never ever imported oil from the US. But this year, according to, calculations, we would be importing some $2.5 billion of oil from the US. And given the fact that it is not a very cost-effective source for India because of the distance and all, but still the effort that we are making has to be recognized by the US. But the deficit is not going to just disappear overnight. In fact, it is not going to disappear at all because of the way the economies are. And this is something that the Trump administration has to understand and accept.
Amity, you raised the point of India sending so many IT workers to the US. Also the fact that India is one of the leading countries when it comes to students going to the US for their education. And that means a lot of investment in the US economy by Indians. But if I was to play the devil's advocate and ask you the simple fact that the US administration under President Donald Trump does not seem to be very appreciative of this. The general sense is that, they want to tighten H-1B visas. They want to actually reduce the number of IT workers who come to the US from other countries, and similarly when it comes to students, the student visa regulations have also become very tough over the last few years. So do you feel that there is an underappreciation of the fact that this is a contribution that India does in the American economy?
I think the Trump administration is taking quite a few things for granted. the easy relationship that we have shared with the US as far as the movement of our students to the US is concerned, as well as, the contribution of the IT sector, Indian IT companies to the US economy. So this is something you've rightly said, it is underappreciated. But if you look at the US industry, they feel completely differently. The US IT industry has been actually making a case for easing of H-1B rules for Indians. And India also feels that it has a very strong case, because in this 2+2 dialogue, although the focus was on defense relationship and trade was also mentioned, but Sushma Swaraj, the Minister for External Affairs, she made it a point to explicitly talk about H-1B visa rules. And also in her press statement, she said that she actually told Mr. Pompeo that this aspect of India's relationship with the US should not be hurt, and they should be sensitive when they are, dealing with H-1B rules as far as Indian IT workers are concerned. So I think India will keep pushing this, and with the support from the industry in the US, this wouldn't be a very big issue.
We've also seen that India of late is talking of retaliation tariffs. One, would you explain to the listeners what exactly retaliation tariffs are? And secondly, if India was to take this action, and India is specifically saying that they are thinking of taking retaliation tariffs against 29 US goods, what does this translate as far as the trade relations between India and the US are concerned?
Earlier this year, I think sometime in March, the US unilaterally decided to impose penal duties on steel and aluminium imports from a number of countries, including India, China, and also European countries. And these duties are actually not very low. Like for steel, it is around 20%, and for aluminium, it is 10%. But the thing is that there is just no valid reason behind these duties. And the reason that the US government is giving, it is actually talking about security issues, which India has challenged. India said that, you are on one hand basically promoting us into very selective defense partner status countries. On the other hand, you are imposing duties on the ground that there are security issues. And also, even if we go by the fact that, security issue is just a front, and they are actually doing it because India has a trade surplus with the US. But that is also unfair, because the trade surplus which India has with the US is very low when compared to countries like China or the EU. So that is one thing which India has actually taken head on. First, it discussed it bilaterally with the US, then it has also taken it up at the WTO. Because at the WTO, India said that, there is just no valid reason behind these duties, and they go against the multilateral rules. And because the US refused to do anything about these duties, then India came up with a notification, I think 2 months back, saying that it would actually retaliate. And it can retaliate because these duties imposed by the US are unilateral. And according to the calculations which have been made by the Commerce Ministry, the duties would add up to something around $230 million. And based on those calculations, India has come up with a list of 29 items which it imports from the US. And it said that if you continue to impose duties on our items, we would be imposing import duties on these items so that it balances off. But since India is interested in basically sorting out this issue in a friendly way, it has not yet imposed these duties. It has been actually putting off the deadline. The first deadline was August 4th. Since the issue could not be sorted out, it has come up with a new deadline of September 18th. So now we have to see what India does on September 18th.
As you mentioned, Amity, India is also thinking about the penal duties which have been imposed by the US on Indian steel and aluminium. And the US is defending it on the ground of security concerns. Right. Is security concern an issue, or is security concern being used as an excuse by the US just in India's case, or do you see this happening when it comes to trade issues and these kind of penal duties even with other countries?
Well, actually, the US has zeroed in on security concerns as a reason for imposing these duties, because so that it can get away with it at the multilateral body WTO. Because at the WTO, it has been arguing with other countries like India, Russia, also the EU, which are at the receiving end of these penal duties. They're saying that it is not an issue to be debated at the WTO because it is a bilateral issue and it is a security issue. And security issue is something which is solely taken by the US government, and it would not allow any multilateral body to rule on that. So that is why I think they have actually zeroed in on this security thing, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense, because India has never ever posed any security threat to the US.
We also see that this trade issue has come up in the same week that we have the US Secretary of State and the US Defense Secretary visiting India. When we see the overall India-US relationship, we see a strong strategic partnership which is in place today. We have some major defense agreements with the US. This trade issue, which is an irritant now in the relationship, do you see an early resolution happening, or do you think that this is something which will drag on in the coming months as we move on?
It is very difficult to say, because on one hand, US has been open to discussing the issue with India. In the case of Canada, in the case of Mexico, they have given some concessions. For Brazil also. So it is not that, they would not be in a position at all to give any concession if they want to. And they have also kept the dialogue route open. It would be basically premature to say that there would be no resolution to this. But at the same time, if we look at the statements that they have been making, unilaterally, even at the WTO, where they are refusing to move from the very basic principle behind which they have used to impose these penal duties. So right now, it is not possible to basically make a guess as to what will happen in the future. But the fact that, the trade issue was discussed in the 2+2 dialogue also, where the two sides accepted that, there is a need to resolve this on a fast-track basis. So there is also hope that there could be a resolution sometime.
Amity, if we were to look at the oil issue between India and the US, and we've also seen, and India has traditionally relied for its oil demands and needs on countries like Iran, for example. How much is the fact that the US today does not want India to import oil from Iran kick in or add to this factor?
All these factors are actually interlinked, because India runs a trade surplus with the US. US wants India to import more from, and oil is something which they are really trying to sell as much as possible to all countries. And it was because of US insistence that we have started buying from the US, and $2.5 billion is not a small amount. But as I said earlier, the US has to understand that it won't be feasible for us to completely replace what we buy from Iran with US oil or with oil from the UAE, because Iran has been not only a reliable supplier of oil to India, but it has also been one of the cheaper sources. They have been giving us lots of concessions. They are also much nearer to us geographically than the US. So for US to imagine that we would, completely stop importing from Iran, I think it is actually expecting too much. And also, if you look at our refineries, they are also geared toward processing oil, the kind of crude we import from Iran. If we were to suddenly stop importing from Iran, we would have to change our refineries. A lot of costs will be involved. We would also need to invest time. And so I don't think that it is really possible for India to completely stop importing from Iran, and the US should not expect that.
We also have the US statement that their formal commitment, what they require from India of additional purchases is of $10 billion annually. As you were pointing out, that realistically it is not going to be possible for India to do many of the things that the US wants us. For instance, replacing the United States as a supplier of oil in place of Iran. But the question is that as the US pushes all this down India's throat, and this is happening in parallel to more positive developments, whether it is the defense sector or it is the foreign affairs sector, realistically, what is the US expectation then out of all this?
I think the whole idea is to keep the pressure on. If we look at what has happened since Trump administration came to power, India has actually worked towards reducing the deficit. For the first time, we have actually been thinking actively on what all we can do to increase imports from the US, because obviously we would not be reducing our exports. So the only way to basically reduce the trade gap is to import more, and which led to the import of oil from the US. But the kind of other demands that they are placing in front of us, like they have frozen our GSP scheme, like the Generalized System of Preferences scheme, where the US was giving us some duty advantage for exports to the country. So they have basically put that on hold, and there is a review going on because two US industries have complained, the dairy industry as well as the medical equipment industry. So the dairy industry, both the industries want us to change our domestic rules to suit them so that they could export to us. So instead of looking at our rules and trying to fall in line so that, they could also export to us, they are basically expecting us to change our domestic rules. So this is something which is unheard of. You can't, force a country to change their rules so that, it would suit your interests. So these unrealistic demands, the US has to understand that these are the demands that cannot be fulfilled. But yes, the pressure tactics has worked, and we can see the deficit going down.
And in the coming days, we will continue to follow this story as India and the United States try and sort out their trade issues. With this, we bring today's discussion to an end. Thank you.
Thank you.
You are listening to a discussion on India-US trade relations. The participants were Amity Sen, economic analyst, and Simran Sodhi, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. This program is also available on our website newsonair.nic.in.